Now this is a story all about how a Patreon sub asked about politics. Now, I'd like to take a minute, just sit right there, while I preach on semantics and toss my hair.
Danger, danger, high voltage, when we touch, when we cheers.
Don't worry, if I get enough time, I'll get back to Kill All Normies later today and talk about chapter 1 of that. But I want to encourage my Patreons to engage with me, and so when one of them sends me some questions, why not answer them? So one of my Patreon subs, Wix, asking me about some of the things I've talked about in recent videos. Since I want to encourage my patrons to engage with me and, get what they're paying for, here we go. So in several of my videos, I talk about the left liberal position tending to be freedom from, and the libertarian right position tending to be freedom to. And Wix seems to think this is usually described the other way around, but I've only heard it described the other way around very recently, like literally yesterday, and in these questions that Wix sent. Otherwise, it's always been the way that I've described it. That was the way it was described in my politics classes and everywhere else, and it just seems to make sense when you look at it. So typically I find that the left liberal side tends to concentrate more on freedom from, that is, freedom from hunger, freedom from exposure, freedom from ignorance, and it sets about providing those freedoms, usually via the state, for a variety of historical reasons that we won't really get into here. The right, on the other hand, is typically talking about freedom to, which is why they're so anti-regulation, anti-state interference, and so on. They want to maximize individual liberty in terms of individual liberty to do things, rather than individual liberty in terms of freedom from things. It's not just the right, there's the libertarian side as well. So that might be maybe the right to smoke pot because it's nobody else's business, or the right to own a gun, which gets a bit more sticky. The two kinds of freedom, that freedom from and freedom to, are typically but not always in tension with each other. So, someone's freedom to smoke pot doesn't particularly impinge on anybody. So that's one where it doesn't clash. But there are other instances, like gun ownership, where your freedom to own a gun impacts on my freedom from gun violence, misfires, random shootings in the street, all kinds of other things. You can argue the toss about it, but that's the structure of the argument, at least. Even if you don't agree on what's being said, you can at least agree that that's the framing of the argument. So another example might be your freedom to dump toxic waste, for example, without regulation and control, might impinge on my freedom from drinking poison and dying. It's an extreme example, but it's one that, well, not necessarily that extreme if we look at Flint, but yeah, it makes the point. So it doesn't mean that every right that the liberal left wants is freedom from, or that every right that the libertarian right wants is freedom to. It's just an overarching tendency that tends to take everybody in that way. Semantics are important, so dismissing something as a semantic argument isn't a good way to go, in my opinion, because if we can't agree on terms, even just for the length of the discussion, then I think we've got some problems, because if you can't agree on a common language, you can't communicate. So yeah, what I'm describing here is typically the way it goes. Now, Wick rightly points to the wedding cake fiasco as an example of where this kind of terminology and stuff can break down a bit, and how it isn't necessarily as clear cut. You've got LGBT, all the rest, whatever, the rest of the alphabet people asking for freedom from discrimination, but also freedom to buy their wedding cakes wherever they damn well please. And on the other hand, you've got ardent Christians of a particular type who are demanding freedom from state interference and freedom to discriminate according to their faith and practice according to their faith. There's ins and outs of all these arguments, but this is how each side is framing it, and at least we can agree on how people are framing it, even if we think they're being disingenuous or wrong or whatever else. But these are the kinds of edge cases that keep things interesting. if you want, I can dive into this whole specific fiasco around the wedding cakes in a later video. But here I just want to concentrate on these replies. But it's a fantastic example of how these things do get messy. When I tend to talk about these things, I'm generally talking more broadly, though, rather than getting down into the nitty-gritty. I prefer most of the time to talk about broad principles of ideologies and so on, rather than necessarily getting right down into the detail. I think there's enough people that do that. I prefer to talk in broader strokes, generally, not always. Not all, hashtag not all. So, yeah, obviously you're going to be able to pick holes when it comes down to very specific instances, and people do like to shift phrasing in order to frame themselves as the victim, the people who are being impinged upon. You know, we see that happen with identity politics and victim politics and so on. You know, these aren't new issues. Put it that way. So Wick also points out quite effectively that we do have a lot of issues around political terminology, especially when we're discussing things internationally, because, I mean, just between the UK and the US, liberal has different meaning, socialist has different meaning, and so on. You know, and it makes it very difficult to communicate unless you spend time being clear about what you're talking about. I mean, people think libertarian only means laissez-faire, right-wing, brown droid economics type libertarianism, when it doesn't. You can have left libertarians, you can have cultural libertarians. You know, it's just that focus on personal freedom would seem to be the defining factor in that. And the socialism issue, when I talk about socialism, I'm generally talking about socialism as its own ideology, not as a transitional stage, as Marxism describes it. And when I talk about state socialism, I mean everything controlled by the state, not necessarily a state that's socialist. You know, these things get difficult. It's unfortunate, but we just have to unpick them and work around them and try to use the proper terminology where we can. I mean, Wick specifically brings me up on my use of the term socialism, but, you know, I have described this plenty of times. I've written a twit longer, you know, expressing the difference, referencing Roger Scruton's Dictionary of Political Thought, which is a fantastic reference for anyone who wants to get into political discussions. I'll link to the twit longer and where you can get a copy of the book below, but I've addressed the socialism thing so many times, I don't think it's really worthwhile me doing so in detail here yet again. Hopefully that answers your questions, and I can get on with other stuff today. Zang! Old Fat Punks is part caper, part comedy, part nostalgia, and part commentary. It follows three aging punks as they build themselves up for one big, nihilistic last hurrah. You can buy Old Fat Punks at Amazon, Drive-Thru Fiction, or Lulu.com. Follow the links below or search on those sites.